The man who rode into Caldwell, Kansas on a bitter October morning in 1883 was not the man who had left Missouri 3 years prior, or so he desperately needed everyone to believe. He came in on a sorrel mare with a cracked left shoe, a bedroll strapped behind the saddle, and a name he had practiced saying aloud every night along the trail until it stopped feeling like a lie. Roscoe Bristol. That was who he was now. Roscoe Bristol, drifter, looking for work, looking for land, looking for a future that did not carry the weight of everything he had burned down behind him. He tipped his hat to nobody in particular as he rode down the main street, past the general store and the land office and a barber shop with a crookedly painted sign, and he told himself that this was the place. This flat, wind-scoured stretch of Kansas border country, where the cattle drive still moved through, and the soil still turned for a man willing to break his back on it. This was where Roscoe Bristol would become real. He stabled the mare at the livery on the south end of town, and paid for 3 nights with coins. He counted carefully from a worn leather pouch. The liveryman, a stout fellow named Gerald Potts who smelled permanently of horse liniment, took the money without comment and gestured toward a water trough. Roscoe led the mare over and stood beside her while she drank, one hand resting on her neck, watching the street. Caldwell sat just north of the Cherokee Strip, and in those years it functioned as a cattle town of some significance, the last real settlement before the long drive north met civilization. It was rough and it was lively, and it was exactly the kind of place where a man could arrive without papers and find work within a day if he looked capable. Roscoe looked capable. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark weathered skin and a jaw that had not been shaved in 2 weeks. His eyes were a quiet gray that people often mistook for cold until they spoke to him long enough to find the warmth underneath. He took a room at the Drover's Inn, a 2-story frame building that leaned slightly to the east as though perpetually curious about something across the street. The innkeeper charged him $1 a week and gave him a key that did not quite fit the lock but could be convinced with enough patience. Roscoe set his saddlebag on the narrow bed, sat down beside it, and stared at the wall for a long moment. He was not a bad man. He needed to believe that, needed it the way a drowning man needed a handhold. He had made a terrible mistake in Missouri, and the consequences of that mistake had followed him like a shadow for 3 years. And now he was going to leave them behind the way a snake leaves its skin, cleanly and completely. Roscoe Bristol had no past. He was simply a man who had arrived in Caldwell looking to work honest land. The next morning he found the work easy enough. A rancher named Augustus Delmer had a spread 3 miles east of town and needed a hand for the winter, someone to mend fence and break the 3 young horses he had bought cheap at a trail-end auction. Roscoe presented himself at the ranch gate before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, and Augustus Delmer looked him over with the efficient eye of a man who had hired and lost many hands. "You ride?" Delmer asked. "Since I was 7, Roscoe said. "Break green horses. Done it most of my life." "You drink to excess?" Roscoe paused just half a heartbeat. "No, sir." Delmer hired him on the spot, and Roscoe started that same afternoon. And for the first several weeks things were exactly as simple as he needed them to be. He woke before dawn. He worked until dusk. He ate at the bunkhouse table with 2 other hands named Orville and Dex who were mostly interested in playing cards and complaining about the wind. He was polite and capable, and he kept to himself. And slowly, gradually, the knot between his shoulder blades began to loosen. It was not until the 3rd week of November that he met Matilda Hart. She came to the Delmer Ranch on a Tuesday, driving a wagon herself with the particular straight-backed efficiency of a woman who has never had anyone to do the driving for her. She was delivering a bolt of wool and a crate of preserved goods that Augustus Delmer's wife, Eleanor, had ordered from Hart's General Supply in town. Roscoe was in the yard working on a fence rail when the wagon came through the gate, and he straightened up and watched without thinking to pretend he was not watching. Matilda Hart was 26 years old, and she moved through the world like someone who had decided years ago exactly how much nonsense she was willing to tolerate, which was considerably less than most people offered. She had dark auburn hair pinned beneath a practical felt hat, and green eyes that took stock of things quickly and without apology. She was not small, not the delicate variety of pretty that the novels described. She was something better than that. She was the kind of woman who looked like she belonged in the landscape she inhabited, as though the prairie had grown her specifically for itself. She pulled the wagon to a stop near the house, set the brake, and climbed down before either of the other hands could think to offer assistance, which was not a slight but simply her nature. She unloaded the first crate herself before Eleanor Delmer came out the front door and called her inside for coffee. Roscoe went back to the fence rail. He spent the next 10 minutes telling himself he was not listening for the sound of her voice from inside the house, and then spent another 10 failing at it. When she came back out, she found him struggling with a particularly stubborn post that had sunk crooked in the frozen ground. She stood for a moment watching him work it. "You need a longer bar," she said. He looked up. "I beg your pardon. For leverage, you need a longer iron bar. The one you have is maybe 3 feet. You want something closer to 5 to get under that post at the right angle." He looked at the bar in his hand and then at the crooked post and then back at her. She was not being unkind. She was simply being accurate. "I expect you are right," he said. "There is one in the bed of my wagon. I use it for deliveries. You are welcome to borrow it." He followed her to the wagon, and she handed down a long iron bar, and he went back to the fence post, and she was exactly right. The post came free in under 2 minutes. He reset it properly and tamped the ground around it and then returned the bar to her. "Much obliged," he said. "Roscoe Bristol." She took his offered hand and shook it with the clean firmness of someone who had no patience for limp handshakes. "Matilda Hart. I supply the general store in town." "You own it." "I do. My father left it to me when he passed 18 months ago. He built it from scratch in '78. There was something in the way she said it, not grief exactly, not anymore, but a kind of quiet pride that had grown up through the grief the way prairie grass grows through a fire-scorched field. He recognized it because he had his own grief tucked inside him like a stone he could not put down. "I am sorry for your loss," he said, and he meant it with the full weight of a man who understood what it was to lose something permanent. She looked at him a moment longer than was strictly polite, as though she were reading something in his face that she had not expected to find there. Then she nodded, climbed back onto the wagon seat with that same self-sufficient grace, and clicked her tongue at the horses. He watched her drive away and did not pretend he was not doing that either. He did not see her again for 2 weeks, because the weather turned savage in early December and the drifts piled up against every structure on the Delmer ranch, and the work became a constant battle against the cold. He thought about her more than he meant to, more than was comfortable, in the particular way a man thinks about something he knows is both wonderful and complicated. She was wonderful because she was exactly herself, unvarnished and clear-eyed and sharply intelligent. She was complicated because Roscoe Bristol was not his name, and whatever a woman like Matilda Hart deserved, she deserved a man who started with the truth. He went into town on a Friday in mid-December to pick up supplies for the ranch, and he found himself standing inside Hart's General Supply without having precisely intended to go there first. The store was warm from the stove in the corner, and it smelled of coffee and dry goods and the cedar planks of the shelves, and Matilda was behind the counter working through an account ledger with the focused attention of someone who does not intend to be wrong. She looked up when the bell above the door jangled. "Mr. Bristol," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite warmth yet but was leaning in that direction, the way a plant leans toward light before it has fully committed to the motion. "Miss Hart," he said, and he took his hat off when he came through the door, which he noticed she noticed. He bought flour and coffee and a tin of axle grease and a new pair of work gloves, and then he stood at the counter longer than the transaction required, and she did not hurry him away, which told him something. "Cold enough for you?" he asked, which was the most ordinary thing anyone could say in Kansas in December, and he said it because he was suddenly and unexpectedly nervous, which he had not been about anything in 3 years. "I have always found it to be exactly as cold as it is," she said, which was a precise and slightly funny answer, and when he smiled at it she allowed herself a small one in return. "I was wondering," he said, and then he stopped because he had not finished deciding whether he was going to say the rest of it. She waited. She was good at waiting. She had the patience of someone who had learned that most things worth knowing take a moment to arrive. "If you are not otherwise engaged on Sunday afternoon, I wondered if you might let me buy you a meal at the hotel dining room," he said, "as thanks for the fence post advice, which I am told saved me about 45 minutes of wasted effort." "Who told you that?" she asked. "Orville. He watched the whole thing and has an opinion about everything." She closed the ledger and considered him with those direct green eyes. He held very still and did not look away, which cost him something. "I appreciate the invitation," she said. "I will meet you there at noon." He put his hat back on and gathered his purchases and walked out into the biting December cold, feeling unreasonably pleased about the whole world. Sunday came with a hard frost and a sky so blue it looked painted, and Roscoe put on his cleanest shirt and brushed the dust from his good hat and rode into town with a kind of careful hope he had forgotten he was capable of feeling. Matilda was already at the hotel dining room when he arrived, punctuality apparently being another of her many orderly virtues, and she had taken a table by the window and was reading a newspaper, which she folded neatly when he came in. They ate roast beef and boiled potatoes and fresh bread, and they talked for 2 hours without once running out of things to say, which was itself a kind of miracle. She told him about her father, James Hart, who had come to Caldwell from Ohio in 1878 with $400, a wagon full of dry goods, and a stubbornness that the Kansas wind could not match. She told him about running the store through the first terrible summer alone, about learning the accounts and the inventory and the ordering and the relationships with the wholesale suppliers in Wichita. She told him that she had 2 older brothers who were ranching in Colorado and wrote twice a year, and felt that was sufficient. "It is not sufficient," she said, in a tone that made clear she had long since made peace with the insufficiency. He told her about the ranch work, about the horses, about Augustus Delmer's 3 young mares who were coming along nicely. He told her about growing up in Missouri, which was true. He told her he had been moving around for a few years, looking for the right place to put down roots, which was also true, carefully framed. He did not tell her his name had been something else when he lived in Missouri. They met the following Sunday as well, and the Sunday after that, and somewhere in the space between Christmas and the New Year, a thing that had been trying to become what it was finally allowed itself to be named, at least privately, at least inside his chest, where he kept the things he was not yet ready to say aloud. He was falling in love with Matilda Hart. He was falling in love with the way her mind moved, quick and lateral and precise. He was falling in love with the way she laughed, fully and without self-consciousness, when something struck her as genuinely funny. He was falling in love with the fact that she had her own opinions about cattle prices and territorial law, and the question of whether Kansas would ever fully recover its reputation after the troubles of the previous decade, and that she expressed those opinions directly and defended them when challenged with nothing more than logic and evidence. She did not simper. She did not wait for permission to take up space. She was simply, completely, irreducibly herself, and he was aware with a terrible clarity that he was not the same, that there was a version of himself he had buried under a different name, and he was still, every day, pretending it had never existed. In January, he kissed her for the first time. They had been walking along the edge of town after Sunday dinner, down a road that turned to open prairie within a quarter mile, and the sun was going down in the kind of spectacular winter colors that Kansas did better than almost anywhere on earth, all rose and amber, and a deep reddish violet along the horizon. They had stopped talking because the sky had simply demanded silence, and then he had turned to find her already looking at him, and the moment between turning and kissing was very short. Her lips were cold from the air and warm underneath, and she kissed him back with the same directness she brought to everything, no coyness, no pretending it had not happened, and when they stepped apart she looked at him very steadily. "I have been thinking that might happen," she said. "And?" he asked, because her face was thoughtful and he could not read everything in it yet. "And I think I am glad it did," she said, which was the most careful version of glad he had ever heard, but it was real, and he felt it settle into him like the first warmth after a long cold stretch. He wanted to tell her then. He almost did. He had the words arranged and was reaching for them, and then they slipped away from him because he was afraid, and the fear was not small. The fear was the size of everything he had built in the last 3 years, the size of the careful structure of Roscoe, Bristol, that he had assembled piece by piece across 2 states and a territorial border. The mistake in Missouri had not involved violence. He needed to be clear about that within himself. He had not hurt anyone in the physical sense. He had been 28 years old and deeply, disastrously in love with a woman who was engaged to another man, and he had helped her leave, which was to say he had helped her breach a legal and social contract that her family had considerable influence in enforcing. The woman in question, Cora Aldridge, had wanted to leave. She had wanted to leave badly enough to ask a near stranger for help, and he had given it because he was young and romantic, and because he had told himself he loved her, which at 28 he probably believed, though what he felt now for Matilda made that earlier feeling seem like a sketch compared to an oil painting. Cora had eventually made it to her sister in St. Louis, and from there he did not know. What he knew was that her family, the Aldridge family, had a great deal of political reach in 3 counties, and that her father had spoken to a judge who had decided that what Roscoe had done constituted some combination of interference and fraud that was technically prosecutable. He did not believe the case would have held in a proper court. He also had not wanted to find out. He had left Missouri under his own name, James Rourke, and had spent 3 years becoming someone else. He had not hurt anyone. He had helped someone escape a situation she had not chosen. And yet the law in that particular county in that particular moment had not seen it that way, and he had run, and running had made him look guilty of more than he was, and the guilt of the running had compounded the rest until the whole thing sat inside him like a coal that would not cool. He told himself he would tell her soon. Not today, but soon. February arrived, and with it, a brief warm spell that made the whole prairie smell of mud and potential. And Roscoe found himself spending every Sunday in town, and inventing reasons to come in on Thursdays as well. And Matilda did not pretend she had not noticed the increase in frequency. "You have been needing a great deal of supplies for one ranch hand," she said one Thursday, looking at the modest quantity of his purchase with an expression of wry clarity. "I am a very careful man," he said. "I prefer to shop often and in small quantities." "You are a very transparent man," she said, smiling, which is not the worst thing to be. He kept the smile on his face and felt the gentle stab of that word, transparent, which he was not. Which he needed to be but could not quite make himself be yet. He asked her, in late February, if she would consider allowing him to court her properly, with the full acknowledgement of what they were doing and where it might go. She looked at him for a long moment. "I have been considering you properly courting me for about 6 weeks," she said. "I was beginning to wonder if you required a formal invitation." "You might have said something," he pointed out. "So might you," she replied. He took her hand and she let him hold it there in the store with the winter light coming through the front window in long pale slabs, and it was the most right he had felt in years, and he was also, underneath that rightness, terrified. He wrote a letter in March. He addressed it to his mother in Missouri, his actual mother, Clara Rourke, who was the only person in the world who knew where he had gone. He told her he had found a place and a person, and that he thought he might stay. He told her he was thinking about telling her the truth, the woman, the truth about himself. He asked his mother what she thought. Her reply came 3 weeks later, written in the careful schoolteacher handwriting she had always had. She said that she thought telling the truth was almost always the right thing, and that she had prayed every night since he left that he would find the courage to go back to himself. She said the situation in Missouri had largely quieted, that old Aldridge had died the previous fall, and the sons had other things on their minds, and that she did not believe anyone was still actively interested in finding a man named James Rourke for a 3-year-old dispute about a woman who was now happily remarried in St. Louis. She said she loved him very much and that she hoped this woman he had found was worthy of the son she had raised, and also that the son she had raised should try harder to be worthy of whoever this woman was. He read that letter 4 times and then folded it and put it in his breast pocket and let it sit against his heart for 3 days like a compass he was not yet sure how to use. The situation arrived, as things tend to, before he was ready for it. It was the second Friday in April, and the weather had finally, definitively turned toward spring. Roscoe was in town to pick up a letter Augustus Delmer was expecting from a cattle buyer, and he had stopped in at Hart's General Supply, because he stopped in at Hart's General Supply every time he came to town now. It had simply become a fact of his life, and Matilda was behind the counter with her account ledger and her green eyes and her auburn hair slightly loosened from its pins in the warm afternoon. And he was thinking that he was going to tell her everything that Sunday because he could not continue to feel this way about her while being fundamentally dishonest. He was thinking exactly that when the door opened behind him and a man walked in. The man was perhaps 45 years old, with a thick gray-streaked mustache and a suit that suggested he spent more time in offices than on horseback. He had the look of someone who had traveled some distance and was not pleased about it. He stood in the doorway a moment, and then his eyes moved around the store and settled on Roscoe. "Well," the man said, "James Rourke." The words landed in the quiet store the way a rock lands in still water, and everything rippled. Roscoe went very still. He did not turn around immediately. He set down the small packet of coffee he had been holding, and he made himself breathe, and then he turned. "I think you have the wrong man," he said, evenly. "I do not think I do," the man said. "I am Harlan Briggs. I was deputy marshal in Buchanan County, Missouri for 11 years, and I have got a good memory for faces. Yours is particularly distinctive on account of the scar on your left jaw." Roscoe said nothing. The scar on his left jaw, a thin white line from a boyhood fall, was simply a fact of his face. He heard Matilda put her pen down. "There is an old warrant," Briggs continued, and his voice was not unkind, which somehow made it worse. He seemed like a man doing a job rather than a man with any particular animus. "From Buchanan County. Interference with a civil contract, it was filed as. No one has been actively looking, the principal complainant being deceased, but the warrant still exists, and I happen to recognize you coming out of the livery." "I told you," Roscoe said, "you have the wrong man." "Sir," Matilda said from behind the counter. Both men looked at her. "What is the nature of this warrant?" she asked. Her voice was her business voice, precise and calm, which told Roscoe nothing about what was happening behind her eyes. Briggs explained it briefly. "A woman named Cora Aldridge. A broken engagement. A man named James Rourke who had facilitated her departure in a manner that the Aldridge family had argued was legally actionable. 3 years ago. Buchanan County." Matilda listened to all of it without expression. Then she looked at Roscoe, and in the 3 full seconds of that look, he saw a great many things move through her face in quick succession: surprise and something that might have been hurt, and then something else that he could not name, something more complex and more thoughtful than either of those. "Mr. Briggs," she said, "I appreciate you bringing this matter to attention. I wonder if you might give me a moment to close up the shop before we discuss this further. I have some things I would like to say, and I would prefer to say them privately." Briggs blinked, apparently having expected a different response to the situation. he agreed with the slight bewilderment of a man who has been politely but firmly managed and stepped back outside. Roscoe stood in the quiet store with Matilda. "Matilda," he said, and his voice was the voice of a man with no defenses left, which was a kind of relief alongside the fear, the way putting down a heavy thing is a relief even when you are not sure what happens next. "Is it true?" she asked, not accusing, simply asking. "Yes," he said. "My name is James Rourke. I came here 3 years ago from Missouri. The situation with the woman, with Cora, it was not what it sounds. She wanted to leave the engagement. She asked me for help. I gave it. Her family had influence and they used it. I ran because I was young and afraid, and I did not want to find out what their version of justice looked like." Matilda was quiet for a moment. "You helped a woman leave a situation she did not want to be in," she said. "Yes. And for that you gave up your name." "And for that," he agreed. "And because I ran, which made me look worse than I was, and I have known that every day since." She came around from behind the counter, which put her closer to him than she had been, close enough that he could see the small details of her face, the slight furrow between her brows that meant she was thinking seriously. "I am angry," she said. "I want you to understand that I am angry, not because of Missouri. I actually think you did the right thing in Missouri, and the rest of it, the running, the fear, I understand more about that than you might expect. My father ran from Ohio ahead of a debt he could not pay. He told me about it 3 days before he died. He had kept it 40 years. I have thought about that constantly for the 18 months since." Roscoe waited. "I am angry," she continued, "because you looked me in the eye every Sunday for 4 months and let me fall in love with a man I only half knew. And I think I deserved to know the other half." "You did," he said, and there was nothing else he could honestly add to that. She was exactly right, and they both knew it. "My question now," she said, "is what you intend to do about Mr. Briggs." "I do not know," he said honestly. She straightened her shoulders, which was a thing she did when she had made a decision. He had noticed it enough times to recognize it. "I know a man," she said. "George Alderman. He practices law in Wichita. He is the best land and civil attorney in this part of Kansas. If the principal complainant is deceased and the woman in question is happily settled, then I suspect that warrant is a good deal less solid than your former deputy marshal believes." She picked up her shawl from the hook near the counter and put it on. "You are going to walk out there with me," she said, "and you are going to talk to Mr. Briggs, and you are going to tell him your full and correct name, and you are going to tell him you are willing to correspond with the Buchanan County Court regarding the status of the warrant. And then tomorrow morning you are going to write a letter to George Alderman in Wichita." He stared at her. "You are not afraid," he said, which was not quite what he meant but was the closest he could get. "Of course I am afraid," she said, with a sharpness that was affectionate even as it corrected him. "I am afraid of about 6 different things right now, but I have found that fear and forward motion are not mutually exclusive." She moved toward the door. "Matilda," he said. She stopped with her hand on the door. "Did you hear everything I said?" he asked. "My name is James Rourke." She turned and looked at him, and there it was, under the anger and the fear and the resolute practicality, the warmth that had been building since a Tuesday afternoon in November when she handed him an iron bar and told him what he was doing wrong. "I heard you," she said. "I also heard 4 months of Sunday dinners and Thursday purchases of supplies you did not need, and I heard the way you talk about those 3 young horses like they are people worth respecting. And I heard what you said about my father that first day in a tone that told me you understood grief from the inside. I know the man. The name can be whatever you need it to be, but I want you to know that I find I prefer the man." She opened the door and walked out into the April afternoon, and he stood there for exactly 3 seconds feeling something vast and unmapped open up inside his chest, and then he put his hat on and followed her. The conversation with Harlan Briggs was uncomfortable but not catastrophic. Roscoe, who was making himself be James Rourke again in the full light of day, stated his correct name and his willingness to cooperate with the Buchanan County Court in clarifying the matter. Briggs, who was indeed more bureaucrat than bloodhound, seemed satisfied enough with this response. He said he would report back to Missouri that the individual had been located and was cooperative, and that with the Aldrich family no longer pressing the matter, he expected the warrant would be administratively closed within a few months. He rode south the next morning, and Roscoe stood in the street watching him go, and Matilda stood beside him with her arms crossed against the morning chill. "James," she said, testing the name. "Roscoe is a name I chose deliberately," he said. "I have been thinking, there is no reason I cannot be both, James Roscoe Rourke. The middle name I used was not invented, it was my grandfather's name." She turned that over. "James Roscoe Rourke. It is a substantial name." "I am a moderately substantial man," he said. She laughed fully, the laugh he loved, and then she said, "You should come for dinner Sunday. I make a proper meal on Sundays. You have eaten at the hotel dining room with me every week for 4 months, and it is time I fed you something that does not involve the hotel cook's particular interpretation of what constitutes seasoning." "I would like that very much," he said. She nodded briskly and went back inside her store. He stood on the street a moment longer, and then he went to write a letter to George Alderman in Wichita. The attorney replied within 2 weeks. His assessment was precisely what Matilda had predicted. The Aldrich complainant was deceased. Cora herself, now Mrs. Cora Sinclair of St. Louis, had signed an affidavit indicating she had no complaint against James Rourke, and had in fact been grateful for his assistance. With these circumstances documented, the warrant was essentially paper without substance, and Alderman was confident he could have it formally vacated within the month. He requested a fee that Roscoe, who had been saving carefully for 3 years, could meet without difficulty. He told Matilda on Sunday, standing in her kitchen behind the store where she lived in the 3 rooms her father had built, and she listened with her hands still in the bread dough she was working. "Good," she said. "I told you George Alderman was the best." "You were right about that, as you are about most things," he said. She glanced up at him with that dry look. "Most things. I am leaving room for nuance." She pulled her hands out of the dough and turned to look at him properly. "And what will you do now, once you are legally yourself again?" He had been thinking about this. He had spoken to Augustus Delmer, who had confirmed what Roscoe had been hoping, that there was a piece of land, 80 acres on the east side of the Delmer property, that Delmer would sell at a fair price. He had the beginning of a plan, the kind of plan that had a house in it eventually, and a garden and horses that belonged to him, and roots going down into Kansas soil deep enough that no wind could shift them. "I am thinking of buying land," he said, "and building something on it." The kitchen smelled of bread and wood smoke in the particular earthen warmth of a well-used room, and the April afternoon was coming through the window in long golden light, and Matilda looked at him with the full attention of those green eyes. "What kind of something?" she asked. "A house," he said. "A proper house, big enough for more than one person." The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who understand each other and are choosing their words carefully because the words matter. "James Roscoe Rourke," she said, "are you constructing a very roundabout declaration?" "I am," he said, "because I am finding that I am significantly more nervous about this than I was about the deputy marshal." "That is," she said, oddly reassuring. He took a breath. "Matilda Hart. I came to Caldwell looking for a place to be someone new, and I found instead a woman who made me want to be myself again. That is the truest thing I know how to say. I love you. I want to build that house, and I want to build it with you if you will let me." She had flour on her left cheekbone, and her hair was escaping its pins, as it did whenever she was working seriously at something, and she looked more beautiful than anything he had a right to look at, and she took her time answering, which was exactly right. "I love you too," she said. "I believe I have loved you since you admitted the fence post was not going the way you wanted it to. Most men would not have admitted that." "I had already decided to try being honest," he said. "You were not entirely successful at it," she pointed out. "I know I am working on it." "Good," she said. Because I have no interest in a man who cannot tell me the truth, and every interest in the man I have been watching work at it for the past few months." She went back to the bread and he sat at her kitchen table, and they talked all through the afternoon about ordinary things, about the store and the land purchase, and what kind of house was practical for Kansas winters. And the sun went down, and she fed him the dinner she had promised, and it was infinitely better than the hotel dining room. And when he left that evening, he walked back to the livery to get his horse, feeling like a man who had finally arrived somewhere after a very long time of moving. The warrant was formally vacated in May. George Alderman sent a copy of the court document, and Roscoe read it 3 times in the bunkhouse before folding it into his breast pocket where his mother's letter had been. The name James Rourke was clean now, officially and legally, and he sat with that for a moment, and then he went and talked to Augustus Delmer about the 80 acres. The land deal was completed by June, payment made in full from 3 years of careful saving, and Roscoe walked the property on the first morning it was his, and felt the particular emotion that has no precise name, the feeling of standing on ground that belongs to you and that you intend to put your full self into. The land was flat and good, with a creek running along the southern boundary and a stand of cottonwoods that would provide some shelter from the northwest wind, and he stood at the center of it and thought about where the house would go. He hired 2 men from town to help with the building, a carpenter named Whitfield who was quiet and excellent at corners, and a general hand named Ruiz who could work from dawn to dark without complaint. He worked alongside them through the summer, learning from Whitfield where his skills were insufficient and contributing where they were not, and the house went up slowly and properly, framed in good lumber hauled from Wichita at considerable expense. Matilda came out on 2 Saturdays to look at the progress. The first time she approved the layout of the rooms in the way she approved of everything, which was to say, she identified one thing she thought should be different, which was the placement of the kitchen window, and then accepted his explanation for why it was where it was, and then conceded that he was probably right. The second time she came out, the walls were up and the roof was on and the windows were installed, and she stood in what would be the front room and turned around slowly, and Roscoe watched her do it. "Well," she said. "Well," he asked. "It is a good house," she said. "It is going to be a very good house." He proposed to her in July, properly and formally, on a Sunday after dinner at her kitchen table, and she said yes with the same directness she brought to everything, which was the most gratifying yes he could imagine. He had acquired, with some difficulty and a great deal of correspondence, a small ring from his mother, his grandmother's ring, a simple gold band with a single garnet that Clara Rourke had mailed to him from Missouri after he wrote to tell her what he was planning. He had also, because it seemed right, and because he was trying very hard to be a person who did right things, written a letter to her 2 brothers in Colorado to inform them of his intentions and to tell them his full name and his full history, including Missouri, including the running. He sent both letters on the same day and waited. The brother named Thomas replied first, and his letter was brief and straightforward. He thanked Roscoe for being honest, said that Matilda had always had better judgment about people than anyone else in the family, and wished him well. The brother named Henry took 3 weeks to reply, and his letter was longer and somewhat more pointed in its questions, but it concluded in the same place. Matilda had apparently written to Henry herself and told him, in terms that Roscoe imagined were quite clear, that her private life was her own and that she would welcome his blessing but not require it. "You wrote to Henry," he said when he found out. "I did," she agreed. "Before or after I wrote to him?" "A week before," she said, with the smallest hint of satisfaction. "I anticipated that you would write to them and I wanted to prepare the ground." "You managed the situation," he said. "I prepared the ground," she repeated. "There is a difference." He kissed her, which he found was a much more effective response than arguing about the distinction, and she allowed it warmly and then told him he needed to go finish the kitchen cabinets. They were married in September of 1884. Matilda closed the store for the afternoon, and they were married at the small Methodist church on the north end of Caldwell, by a minister named Reverend Alcott, who had performed approximately 40 weddings in the territory, and managed to make each one feel particular and significant. Augustus Delmer and his wife Alina were there, and Gerald Potts from the livery was there, and Whitfield the carpenter and Ruiz, and a number of women from town who had become fond of Matilda over the years, and who declared afterward that they had known something like this was happening from the way the man came into the general store every Thursday for no good reason. Thomas, the more agreeable of the two brothers, came from Colorado for the occasion. He was a compact, weathered man of 32 who looked nothing like Matilda except around the eyes, and he shook Roscoe's hand with the firm grip of someone who had made up his mind and was satisfied with the result. "She told me everything about it," Thomas said, "about who you were and what happened in Missouri and all of it." "I am aware," Roscoe said. "I told her she was being too generous, and she told me that generosity and intelligence are not opposites," Thomas said. "I have spent my whole life finding out she is right about things, so I have learned to accept it early." Roscoe found that he liked Thomas very much. Henry did not come, which was a small sadness that Matilda carried quietly. But she carried it the way she carried most things, without letting it diminish what was actually happening, which was considerable. She was married in a dress of deep green wool that she had made herself from the bolt of fabric she had ordered specially from Wichita, and her hair was up, and she had found somewhere a pair of small pearl earrings that had been her mother's, and she stood in the church and looked at Roscoe with the full directness of those green eyes, and said "I do" in the clear, steady voice of a woman who means it completely. He said his own vows in his real name, James Roscoe Rourke, and the name sat well in his mouth, better than it had in years. They moved into the new house after the ceremony. Matilda brought her things in 2 wagon loads and arranged them with the efficiency of someone who has thought about exactly where everything should go. Books on the shelves by the fireplace, the good china in the kitchen cabinet, a braided rug she had made over the course of the previous winter in front of the bedroom door. Roscoe's things were considerably fewer, but they included his grandfather's pocket watch and his mother's letters, and the garnet ring which was back on Matilda's hand where it would remain. On the first night in the house, after the supper things were cleared and the lamps were burning low, they sat together on the porch in the September evening and listened to the prairie making its various nighttime sounds, the insects and the wind in the cottonwoods along the creek, and a coyote somewhere to the east doing its commentary on the whole affair. "James," she said. "Yes," he said, because he was practicing the name and it was getting easier every time. "I am very glad you came to Caldwell," she said. "I am extraordinarily glad I came to Caldwell," he said. "You were looking for a place to start over." "I was. Did you find it?" He looked at her, his wife, in the September dark, and the question was so much simpler than anything that had preceded it. "I found something better than that," he said. "Starting over implies beginning again from the beginning. This is not that. This is bringing everything I actually am to a place that can hold it. That is different." She was quiet a moment. "That is a very good distinction. I have been thinking about it for several months." She took his hand and held it, and they sat there in the evening for a long time without needing to say anything else, and the Kansas sky above them was absolutely full of stars. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was the first winter he had spent in one place in 3 years, and the difference between that and drifting was enormous in ways he kept discovering daily. There was something about waking up in the same room every morning, about having a particular chair in a particular position by the fire, about knowing precisely where your coat hung and which step on the stairs made a sound, that did its quiet work on a person. He could feel himself settling, the way a structure settles, finding its true position in the ground. He ran the ranch through the winter, the 80 acres which had a modest operation of 20 head of cattle and the horses, one of which was the old sorrel mare who had carried him to Caldwell, and who he would not have sold for any consideration. Matilda ran the store, which she continued to do with absolute competence. She had suggested early in their marriage that they simply keep things as they were for the first year, her managing the store and him managing the land, and that seemed entirely right to both of them. Neither was interested in the arrangement where the wife's enterprise dissolved into the husband's upon marriage. She had built that store and it was hers, and she intended to keep it excellent. She came out to the ranch on Saturdays and he came into town on Thursdays, and this pattern had a pleasing symmetry to it that made them both smile when they acknowledged it. "We are still courting," she observed once on a Thursday in February, when he came in and bought 3 items he had not precisely needed. "We are married," he corrected. "Yes, but you still come in on Thursdays for no good reason." "I come in on Thursdays for an excellent reason," he said. "You are here on Thursdays." She accepted this with the small smile that had become one of his favorite things in the observable world. In the spring of 1885 she told him she was expecting, and he received this information by sitting down somewhat abruptly in the kitchen chair, and then recovering himself sufficiently to say the right things, which were heartfelt and numerous. She watched him with affectionate patience through the whole sequence. The baby came in December, a boy they named Thomas James Rourke, the Thomas for her brother and the James because Roscoe had decided to stop running from his own name in all its applications. Thomas James arrived on a cold night with a midwife named Mrs. Clara Bower, who had delivered more than 60 children in Caldwell and its surroundings, and approached the whole business with the brisk confidence of established expertise. He was a healthy, loud, thoroughly present baby who had his father's gray eyes and his mother's tendency to stare at things with an expression of frank evaluation, and Roscoe held him on the first morning of his life in the winter-bright bedroom of the house he had built, and felt something complete and enormous and entirely without words. Matilda looked at both of them from the bed with the profound exhaustion and the particular fierce pride of a woman who has just done something extraordinary. "Thomas James," she said. "It is a good name. It is a family name," he said. "On both sides now." "Both sides," she agreed and smiled. Thomas's first winter was a demanding one, and they managed it the way they managed most things, which was to say that Matilda had opinions about method and Roscoe had opinions about method, and they discussed those opinions with the good-faith directness that had become the foundation of how they did everything together, and they generally arrived at something better than either opinion had been alone. Brother Henry arrived the following spring, apparently having decided that the birth of a nephew was sufficient reason to make the trip from Colorado that the wedding had not been. He was somewhat older seeming than his brother Thomas, a more cautious man, and he came with a slight defensiveness that Roscoe recognized as belonging to a person who is not sure whether he is welcome. Roscoe made a point of being plainly and specifically welcoming, without making a performance of it, and somewhere in the second day of the visit the defensiveness began to relax. Henry held the baby on the evening of his second day there, sitting in the chair by the fire, and looked down at small Thomas with the expression of a man who is being dismantled by something very small and soft, and Matilda watched this from across the room with the look of someone who has been patient about something for a long time and is now receiving the result. "He is a good-looking boy," Henry said. "He takes after his mother," Roscoe said. "He has your chin," Henry said. "I have chosen to regard that as a compliment." Henry actually laughed, which was apparently not something he did frequently, and from that point forward the visit went very well. Henry stayed for 2 weeks and left having extracted a promise that they would bring Thomas to Colorado before the boy was 2 years old. They kept that promise the following autumn, making the trip by rail from Caldwell to Pueblo, and then by wagon to Henry's ranch in the broad country south of Pikes Peak. And it was the first trip they had taken as a family, and it was excellent. The land at Henry's place was different from Kansas, big and dramatic in a way that Kansas never was, all high country and broken peaks, and the aspens turning gold in the October air. Roscoe stood on Henry's porch one evening and looked at the mountains and felt, not for the first time, the strangeness and the gift of the life he had ended up in. He had come to Caldwell to disappear. Instead, he had been found, not by a deputy marshal, not by the past, but by a woman with green eyes and an iron bar, and a particular way of saying true things that made them land exactly where they needed to land. He heard her laughing inside the house, the full genuine laugh, and he thought that was the best sound he knew of on earth. They came home from Colorado in November, and Matilda returned to the store, and Roscoe returned to the ranch, and the rhythms of their life resumed with the comfortable ease of things that have found their proper motion. Small Thomas was walking by then, staggeringly and with tremendous commitment, and the house contained the particular daily chaos of a toddler who has strong opinions about where he wants to be and how he intends to get there. The following year brought a number of changes to Caldwell and to the territory generally. The cattle drives were beginning to shift their patterns as the railroad extended further south, and as the Cherokee Strip came under increasing political pressure. Augustus Delmer sold a portion of his herd and began turning more of his land to wheat, which several of the other ranchers in the area were also considering. Roscoe spent a good deal of the spring of 1887 thinking about the question of what his own land wanted to do. He talked about it with Matilda on several long evenings, going back and forth through the numbers and the land capacity and the market conditions, and she contributed to these conversations with the precision of someone who has been running a supply business for years and understands exactly what the surrounding economy is doing and where it is going. "Wheat is stable," she said, "and this land is good for it. But you love the horses." "I can love the horses and grow wheat simultaneously," he said. "You can," she agreed, "but you should be honest about which one you are doing for income and which one you are doing because it feeds something in you." He considered that. "The horses feed something in me," he said. "The wheat will feed everything else." "Then that is your answer," she said. He turned 35 acres to winter wheat that fall and maintained the horse operation on the remaining land, and it proved, over the next several years, to be exactly the right balance. He developed a small reputation in the county for the quality of the horses he bred and trained, and people came from as far as Wichita to look at what he had, and the income from the wheat provided the stability underneath the thing he loved doing. Thomas James Rourke grew into a vigorous, curious child who had his mother's directness and his father's patience, and his own particular combination of both, which manifested as a boy who asked very good questions, and then waited with complete attentiveness for the complete answer. He followed Roscoe around the ranch from the time he could walk without falling more than twice a day, and he took to the horses with the immediate and natural affinity that told Roscoe this was not something learned, but something simply present in the boy, something he had arrived with. He was 3 years old when Matilda told Roscoe she was expecting their second child. He received this news with considerably less sitting down abruptly than the first time, though the feeling was not smaller. The second child arrived in the spring of 1889, a daughter they named Clara, for Roscoe's mother, and because the name was itself small and clear and perfect. Clara had her mother's auburn coloring and her father's gray eyes in a combination that immediately made people stop and look twice, and she arrived into the world with an opinion about it that she began communicating at once and did not stop communicating thereafter. Clara Rourke and Thomas Rourke were, from the beginning, the best kind of siblings, which is to say that they drove each other absolutely to distraction approximately 30% of the time, and were each other's staunchest allies in the remaining 70. Thomas took his role as older brother with considerable seriousness, and Clara took her role as younger sister by ignoring that designation entirely and treating Thomas as a peer who occasionally required correction. Roscoe's mother, Clara Sr., came to visit in the summer of 1890, making the trip from Missouri by rail, which was by then a reasonable journey, and she arrived at the Caldwell station with 2 large bags and the slightly dazed expression of someone who has been on a train for a very long time and is not entirely sure where they are. He met her on the platform and she looked at him and then put both hands on his face, which was her particular way of establishing whether someone was real, and said, "James, you look like yourself again." He understood exactly what she meant. "Come and meet my wife," he said. He had been slightly anxious about this meeting, not for any reason he could precisely articulate, but simply because the 2 most important women in his life meeting each other was an event large enough to contain nervousness. He should not have worried. Matilda met Clara Rourke on the porch of the house, with Thomas on her hip and Clara in the house doing something inadvisable with the kitchen flour, and she shook Clara's hand and said, "We are very glad you came. I have wanted to thank you for the letter you wrote him about telling the truth. I believe it helped." Clara Rourke looked at Matilda for a long moment and then looked at Roscoe with an expression that said everything it needed to say, and then she said, "I can see that you chose well." "I was chosen," Roscoe said, which was not completely inaccurate. "He is understating," Matilda said, which was exactly right. Clara's visit lasted 3 weeks and was one of the best 3 weeks of Roscoe's adult life. He watched his mother and his wife sit together on the porch in the Kansas evenings and talk with the easy thoroughness of women who have found in each other a quality of attention they enjoy. And he watched his mother hold his children and read to Thomas from the book she had brought from Missouri. And he felt the past and the present occupy the same space without friction for the first time in a very long time. On the evening before Clara was to leave, she sat with Roscoe on the porch after Matilda had put the children to bed, and they were quiet together the way they had always been able to be in the particular ease of long familiarity. "You were afraid it would not work," she said. "Staying, being known." "Yes," he said. "What changed your mind?" He thought about the iron bar and the fence post. He thought about a plate of roast beef at a hotel dining room table. He thought about the way she had walked out of the store to face Harlan Briggs with the exact same practical courage she brought to everything else. "She was not afraid of the truth," he said. "Once I understood that, I had no reason to be afraid of it either." Clara Rourke patted his hand and said nothing else, which was the right response. She left the next morning, and Roscoe and Matilda stood at the station and watched the train pull away. And Thomas waved until the train was entirely out of sight. And Clara the daughter pulled at Matilda's skirt and demanded to know where the train was going. And Matilda told her Missouri, and Clara demanded to know where Missouri was, and the conversation continued in this fashion for the entire walk home. The years that followed had the quality of things that are built properly, not without difficulty, not without weather or the occasional structural stress, but fundamentally sound. The wheat was good for several seasons and only middling for one, and they managed the middling year without catastrophe. The horse operation grew steadily, and Roscoe hired a young man named Daniel Whitehorse in 1891, who had come up from the territory looking for honest work, and who turned out to have more natural skill with horses than anyone Roscoe had ever worked beside. He was a quiet, observant young man of 20 who had grown up on the edge of 2 worlds, his mother's Osage family and his father's settlement homestead, and he understood both better than either side usually credited, and Roscoe paid him fairly and treated him with the respect due an excellent horseman. He was aware, working alongside Daniel, of the injustices that hung over the territory like weather that would not break. The land that had been promised to the tribes through treaty after treaty was being renegotiated and reduced, and in some cases simply taken through political maneuver. And what was coming with the land runs in the Cherokee Strip in 1893 would only continue that process. Roscoe had no illusions about what the settlement of the frontier had cost, and he said so to Daniel once, directly, which was the least he could do. Daniel looked at him for a moment and then said, "Most men in your position do not say that. Most men in my position have not spent enough time examining what their position actually means." Roscoe said. Daniel considered that. Fair enough, he said, and they went back to the horses, which were morally uncomplicated in a way the world was not. In 1892, Matilda hired a young woman named Ruth Caldwell, no relation to the town, who was 20 years old and newly arrived from Illinois and very sharp, and began training her to manage the accounts. She had been thinking for several years about what the store needed as it grew, and what it needed was capable help that she could trust, and Ruth proved to be exactly that. Over the following years, Ruth became Matilda's effective partner in running the business, and this freed Matilda to spend more time at the ranch on Saturdays, and to begin what had been a private project for some time, which was a small lending library she established in the back of the store. A lending library, Roscoe said, when she told him about it. There are 40 families within riding distance of this town, she said, and many of them have children who are being educated in a single-room schoolhouse with books that are 10 years old and falling apart. A library is a practical necessity. I did not say it was not a good idea, he said. I am simply noting the ambition of it. Someone should have noted my ambitions before I met you, she said. They have only grown since. He kissed her for that, and she allowed it, and then went back to discussing the ordering of the first set of books. The library grew over the following years to a collection that served the community in ways that went beyond anyone's initial expectation, becoming a gathering point and a resource and a modest source of local pride. Matilda organized readings twice a month in the winter when people were in town anyway, and these evenings took on a social function that the town had not previously had in quite that form, with families coming in from the surrounding farms and ranches to sit together in the firelit store and listen to someone read aloud and then talk about what they had heard. Roscoe came to every one of these evenings, partly because Matilda asked him to help arrange the chairs and he liked doing that, and partly because watching her in those rooms, in the center of something she had made that the community genuinely loved, was one of the best things he had found in a life that had turned out to contain a great deal that was very good. Thomas was 6 years old in 1891, and Clara was 2, and they were being raised in a house full of books and honest conversation, and the understood principle that work was dignified and truth was non-negotiable, which were the values that their parents held most deeply and passed along most naturally. Matilda had strong opinions about the children's education and applied the same practical intelligence to parenting that she applied to everything else, which was to say she paid close attention to what each child actually was and tried to help that, rather than trying to shape them into something predetermined. Thomas wanted to be around horses the way he wanted to breathe. This was clear by the time he was 5, and Roscoe encouraged it without manufacturing it. By the time the boy was 8, he could manage the gentler horses entirely on his own, and Daniel Whitehorse, who had no children of his own, took a quiet interest in the boy's education and taught him things about horses that Roscoe had never known, things that came from a different tradition of horsemanship that Daniel had learned from his Osage grandfather, and which were in many ways more sophisticated than anything the standard ranching approach could offer. Clara Rourke, the daughter, was different from her brother in almost every particular. Where Thomas was patient and observant, she was quick and verbal, and had opinions about everything before she had all the information required to form them, which was also true of quite a few adults Roscoe had known, and he tried to address it with the same patience he would have wanted applied to himself at her age. She loved the library with an intensity that sometimes required physical management. She would disappear into the back of the store on library evenings and have to be retrieved from behind a stack of books at 9 o'clock. "She is you," Roscoe told Matilda once, watching Clara do this. "She is entirely herself," Matilda said, in the particular tone that meant she was not displeased by the comparison, but was unwilling to accept it uncritically. The years ran their course the way good years do, full and purposeful and marked by the ordinary, extraordinary things of a life being lived deliberately. The Kansas Territory became the state of Kansas, which it had been since 1861, but the broader changes in the region continued to remake the landscape of what was possible and what was gone. The cattle drives that had made Caldwell what it was slowed, and then largely stopped as the railroad networks changed everything about how beef moved from the range to the market. The town adapted, as towns do or do not, and Caldwell adapted partly, with some businesses closing and others finding new purpose and the general store remaining a central fixture, because no matter what else changed, people needed flour and coffee and axle grease and a place to read. Roscoe's wheat and horse operation continued to provide what they needed, and the reputation of the horses he bred and trained grew to the point that in 1894 a buyer came from as far as Kansas City and paid a price for 3 of his horses that made Roscoe quietly and carefully reassess what the operation might become if he expanded the breeding program deliberately. He talked to Matilda about it that evening after the children were in bed. "Kansas City," she said. "Yes. What did you think of the buyer?" "Knowledgeable," Roscoe said, "not trying to take advantage. He paid what the horses were worth, maybe a little more because he knew what he had. Then the reputation is real and it is reaching the right people." It seems so. She was quiet for a moment, running through numbers in her head, which he could tell by the slight stillness of her expression. "If you expanded the breeding program, what would you need? 2 more good mares to start. The right stallion eventually. More pasture, which means the 40 acres along the north that Delmer is talking about selling." "Talk to Delmer about the North Acres," she said. "The mares you can find here or in Wichita. The stallion is the question." "It is always the stallion," he agreed. She looked at him across the kitchen table with the warm, shrewd, entirely familiar look of a woman who knows the man she married very well and has not grown tired of knowing him. "You are happy," she said. "Not a question." "Extraordinarily," he said. "Good," she said. "I think you deserve to be." He corrected. She smiled at that. She agreed. He bought the North Acres from Augustus Delmer in the spring of 1895. He found 2 excellent mares at a rancher's auction in Wichita and brought them home in early June, and Daniel Whitehorse helped him assess them and agreed they were very good choices. And the breeding program expanded in the way that things expand when they are built on a sound foundation, steadily and with increasing confidence. That same year, in September, Matilda discovered she was expecting again, which they had not specifically planned but received with the warmth of people who understand that life offers its gifts on its own schedule. She was 38, and she took this news with equanimity and a practical conversation with Mrs. Bauer, who was still midwifing in Caldwell at an age that suggested she intended to outlast everyone. "You are healthy," Mrs. Bauer said. "The age is not ideal, but it is not disqualifying. Eat well and rest when you can." "When I can," Matilda said, with the expression of a woman who runs a general store and a lending library and manages 2 children and a household, and has some thoughts about what constitutes a realistic resting schedule. The baby came in April of 1896, another boy, and they named him Samuel Arthur Rourke. The Samuel for no one specific, but because both of them liked it, and the Arthur for Matilda's father, whose middle name she had never known until she was going through his papers the week after he died, and found it on an old document from Ohio. Samuel Arthur was a round, peaceful baby who slept better than either of his siblings had managed, which Roscoe privately believed was a mercy offered by the universe in acknowledgement of what they had already managed. Thomas was 10 when Samuel arrived and handled the new baby with the solemn tenderness of a child who takes all of his responsibilities very seriously. Clara was 7 and handled the new baby with the enthusiastic involvement of someone who has ideas about how things should be done and intends to share them, which kept Matilda somewhat occupied in redirecting the enthusiasm productively. Samuel grew into a quiet, observant child, who was different from both his siblings in his particular combination of stillness and depth. He watched the world carefully and spoke about it precisely, and he had a mathematical mind that revealed itself early in the way he approached everything from counting fence posts to measuring feed, to a genuine and early fascination with the account books that his mother let him look at from the time he was 5. Roscoe looked at his 3 children sometimes with a feeling that was still incomprehensible in its dimensions, that he had made this, that he and Matilda had made this family together, these 3 particular people who were going to go out into the world someday and be themselves in it with the full force of everything they were. He thought about the man who had ridden into Caldwell in October of 1883 on a sore-footed sorrel mare with a practiced name and a desperate need to be someone else, and he felt for that man a complicated tenderness. He had been so afraid. He had been so sure that his only option was to reduce himself, to become smaller and simpler, to carve away the parts that were dangerous by being visible. And instead, what had happened was that a woman with an iron bar and no patience for crooked fence posts had shown him that the whole point was to be exactly who he was, clearly and completely, because the parts that were dangerous by being visible were also the parts that were capable of being loved. He told Matilda this one evening in the kitchen, which was where the most important conversations of their life had taken place, while she was going through the ledger and the children were distributed around the house in their various evening activities. She looked up from the ledger. "Say that again." He did. She was quiet for a moment. "That is very true," she said, "and also a very long way of saying that you are glad you came here." "I am extraordinarily glad I came here," he said. "You always say extraordinarily," she said, "because ordinary glad does not cover it," he said. She looked at him with the full attention of those green eyes, and it was 1897, and they had been married for 13 years, and she looked at him the way she had looked at him across this same table in the early months of their marriage, with the direct, clear-eyed, completely unromantic, and therefore absolutely genuine love of a woman who has chosen someone deliberately and is satisfied with the choice. "James Roscoe Rourke," she said, "you are the least disappointing person I have ever known." "That is the finest thing anyone has ever said to me," he said. "I mean it sincerely," she said, and went back to the ledger. He sat at the table and listened to the sounds of his house around him. Thomas outside with the horses in the last of the evening light. Clara reading in her room with the lamp turned up as high as she was allowed. Samuel asleep already because he had the admirable habit of sleeping when he was tired. The wind in the cottonwoods along the creek of the old sorrel mare moving in the paddock, old now and slow but still present, still his companion from the journey that had brought him here. He was home. Not in the way of a man who has found a place to stop running, though it was that too, but in the deeper way, in the way of a man who has found the exact place and the exact people that allow him to be the fullest version of what he is, and who understands that he spent 3 years being smaller than himself for no reason that could not have been resolved much sooner by the simple act of telling the truth. He had been James Rourke. He had been Roscoe Bristol. He had been afraid, and he had been honest, and he had been afraid of being honest, and then he had been honest anyway, pushed there by a woman who had no patience for anything less. He was James Roscoe Rourke, farmer and horseman and husband and father, resident of Caldwell, Kansas, and he was exactly, completely, sufficiently himself. The spring of 1899 came in soft and warm, and on the first genuine warm evening in April Roscoe took Matilda walking along the creek, the way they had walked on Sunday evenings since the early years of the ranch. In the particular private hour after supper when the children were old enough to manage themselves, and the day was winding down to its best quality of light. The cottonwoods were coming into leaf, and the creek was running high with the winter's melt, and the whole prairie smelled of mud and green things and beginnings. "Thomas is talking about going up to study in Wichita," Matilda said. "The agricultural college." "I know," Roscoe said. "He told me last week." "What did you say?" I said I thought it was the right thing for him and that his spot here would be waiting when he was ready to come back to it. Matilda nodded. Thomas was 14 now and already thinking in the long arcs of someone who knows what he wants to do with his life. The horses and the land, same as his father, but with the formal knowledge that Roscoe had never had and which would serve the operation well. Clara wants to teach, Matilda said. I know that too. She would be excellent at it, Matilda said, which was a complicated statement because it was true, and because Clara had the same directness as her mother and the same impatience with people who were not keeping up. But she also had her father's patience when she chose to exercise it, and the combination was potentially very effective in a classroom. She would be excellent at almost anything, Roscoe said, which was also true. They walked along the creek in the April evening, the way they had walked hundreds of times, and the light went down slowly in the western sky the way it did in Kansas, taking its time, and the stars began to appear in the east while the west was still pink, and they were quiet together in the easy way of people who have said everything important to each other and still have more to say. "Do you ever think about Missouri?" Matilda asked. She asked this occasionally, not with any anxiety attached to it, but with the genuine curiosity of someone who wants to know the full geography of the person they are married to. "Occasionally," he said. "Less than I did. Mostly I think about here." "What about here?" "About this," he said. "This exact thing, this walk, this evening, how I almost did not stay. What made you stay in the beginning?" He looked at her. This was a question she had not asked before in exactly this form, and he took it seriously. "You," he said. "You, and also the horses and the land and the sense that this might be the place where I could stop making myself smaller, but mostly you." "I did not ask you to stay," she said. "You handed me an iron bar and told me I was doing something wrong," he said. "That is an invitation in my experience." She laughed the full laugh which still, after 16 years of knowing it, made something in him lift the way a hawk lifts on warm air, effortlessly and all at once. "An iron bar," she said. "I handed you an iron bar. You saw what I needed and you gave it to me without making me feel lesser for needing it. That is a very particular skill, Matilda. Not everyone has it." She was quiet a moment. "I saw a man struggling with a fence post who was willing to be told what would help," she said. "That is also a particular skill." He stopped walking and she stopped beside him, and the creek moved over its stones with the sound it had made every evening of every year he had lived on this land, and the April dark settled gently around them both. He took her hand, the hand with the garnet ring, the ring that had been his grandmother's and was now hers, worn smooth and bright from all the years of living. "I love you," he said, and after 16 years of saying it, which had not made it smaller but had made it larger, more specific, more layered with all the particular instances of loving her that had accumulated, it still came out with the same weight it had carried the first time. "I love you too," she said, and she said it the same way, with the full and unemphatic directness that was her way with every true thing. They stood there in the April night beside the creek on the land that was theirs, and the stars came fully out above the Kansas prairie, and behind them in the house with its lit windows, their children were going about the ordinary business of their own lives, and the old sorrel mare moved somewhere in the dark of the paddock, and everything that was broken and frightened and false in the man who had ridden into Caldwell 16 years ago had long since been resolved into this. Into the man who was standing here holding his wife's hand beside a creek in the spring evening, fully himself and fully known and precisely, entirely, irreducibly at home. He had come to the territory to start over with a new name, and she had known the old one when it came to light, and she had looked at him with those clear green eyes and told him without hesitation that she preferred the man. And the man, at long last, had believed her. And that had been enough. That had been more than enough. That had been everything.